Welcome to my presentation on physical-based rendering. Physical-based rendering, or PBR, is the rendering technique designed to simulate a real-world phenomenon. The basis of PBR is the irradiance equation. The irradiance of a point in space describes the amount of light energy coming and hitting that point from all directions in the hemisphere above the point's normal. To calculate this value, samples are taken from theoretically all directions around this point and summed together, whereas a single sample is known as a direction's radiance. In practice, however, sampling infinitely many directions is computationally impossible. Instead, there are two different approaches: IBL, or image-based lighting, or just using lights directly. Image-based lighting sums up the integral by taking quantifiable steps around the hemisphere and using the resultant directions as coordinates on a convoluted cube map. The cube map in question is the pre-baked lighting of the scene. A simpler approach, however, would be to just use point lights in the scene, taking the radiance of all directions except towards these lights as equal to 0, whereas the radiance towards these lights is taken as 100% of the light's energy. On top of calculating the radiances from the light sources to the point in space, the bidirectional reflection distribution function is also used. This function is used to describe how the material's surface properties interact with light. A core part of PBR describes materials as having micro peaks and micro valleys all across the material's surface. This roughness influences in particular the specular lighting of the material. Specular lighting can be broken down into three parts: the distribution function, the geometry function, and lastly the Fresnel effect. The distribution function describes the average magnitude of difference between the angle of the microfacets to their surface normal. The geometry function describes the amount of light that is both blocked and shadowed by microvalleys and mountains across the surface. And lastly, the Fresnel effect describes how much light is reflected based on how shallow the viewing angle is from the material and its observer. The way the program was designed was to allow for easy implementation of new shaders and new materials. As such, each material has access to the shader attached to it and a group of dictionaries for each material property. These dictionaries are set up to be arbitrary so that any shader can have access to a material property without the need to hardcode anything. When rendering to the screen, I've opted to also use a buffering system. This is done by drawing the scene to a texture first, before following it up by rendering said texture to a quad. Shaders themselves have also been combined, having the fragment and vertex shader within a singular file. To compile these shaders separately, both shaders are put into if-define statements, whereas when trying to access a given one of these shaders, I can append to the string a #define. My analysis will be performed over three separate shaders: a Phong shader, the GGX approach used by Learn OpenGL, and a customized shader using both Torrance Sparrow specular lighting and Oren Nayar's diffuse light calculations. These tests will involve each shader having its performance calculated against a given number of lights in the scene, starting from 1 and ending at 13. To get valid performance results, for each test I let the program run for about 10 seconds and then sampled 24 frames and averaged them. Repeated this, as stated, for each shader 13 times, where I would increase the light count by 1. By the end, these were my results. Though not particularly clear at first, there does appear to be trends forming as the lights are added. Torrance Sparrow starts well but begins to become the slowest out of all three, whereas the Phong shader appears the most erratic but unsurprisingly could be considered the most efficient when converted to a straight plot. Ideally, both the sample size and tests done with light counts should be increased. However, without implementing new approaches, the largest arrays I can put on my system are 13. Doing any more will cause the shaders to fail to compile. The visual tests, however, are a bit more cut and dry. The red metal of the sword most resembles the red metal of this can. The Phong shader, as shown on the right, doesn't appear to hold much of a competition when compared to the can. The Learn OpenGL GGX shader, however, looks a lot better. The colour is maintained very well, and the bright white glows for when the light is parallel or at sharp angles. Unsurprisingly, however, the colour of the background is not reflected, unlike real life. The Torrance Sparrow or Oren Nayar model definitely beats out Phong shader, however it has its issues. The white shine is completely lost and the whole material looks a lot darker, even with the same material properties as the GGX shader. Overall, the best shader with both performance and visual quality would have to be the Learn OpenGL GGX shader model. As stated before, however, it would be worth doing tests with greater numbers of lights and with a greater number of frame samples. Thank you for watching my presentation. Here are my references.